Greetings, all ye landlubbers. I am Admiral Anil Chopra, with 40 years at sea, perhaps many more all at sea. And today I propose to take you far from your natural habitat on terra firma to the vast heaving expanse of the oceans, wherein we shall explore the phenomenon of sea power, which has indeed shaped much of our modern world and continues to be greatly relevant in our times. This is how our wonderful planet looks from outer space. How truly blue it is. But that blue you see in the picture is not the blue sky that we are used to. It is the ocean. Water, water everywhere, covering more than 70% of the Earth's surface. And this long view also shows what we often forget, that the ocean is one unbroken, interconnected continuum. No borders, no boundaries, no fences. It is only for our own geographical and geopolitical ends that we have broken this one ocean into five: the Pacific, the Atlantic, the Indian, the Arctic, and the Southern Oceans. For the same reason, we have further divided this ocean into seas, 105 by last count, and bays and gulfs and what have you. But I'd like to reiterate that the ocean is one, and access to any one part of it allows you access to the whole. Even more importantly, this one humongous ocean belongs to no one, to no state or company or individual. It is neither controlled and nor owned by any grouping. The seas are free, the last great commons of all humanity, and except for the territorial waters of coastal states, free and available for use by all mankind. Imagine there are no property rights over almost 3/4 of the surface of this planet, except again for a country's territorial waters, which extend out only 12 miles from the coast. Certainly, the demarcation of EEZs for coastal state does not impede or inhibit the right of freedom of navigation and maneuver by vessels of all other nations in the same waters. So as we explore this subject today of sea power, please remember these three overarching facts. Firstly, the ocean covers 70% of the planet. Strangely enough, that is the same percentage of water in your bodies. Secondly, it is an unbroken body of water. And third, it is free for all mankind to use and has no owner. Today, over 150 of the 192 member states of the United Nations are coastal states. That means they have access to the sea on their shores. And 80% of humanity lives near the ocean, actually within 200 nautical miles of it. A vivid nighttime photograph of the Earth makes this point. The centers of population and industry are well lit, and the lighting nearly matches the coastlines of the continents. This region bordering the sea is often referred to as the littoral and is the most industrialized portions of the Earth, but also the focus of most global conflict. Of course, the oceans are now increasingly also critical for trade and transportation in a globalized world and are vital for geo-economic advantage. For the same reason, 90% of global trade by volume, including vital energy shipments of oil and gas, is seaborne. The same sea lines of communication which carry goods and cargo are also the energy lifelines for many nations, and particularly for India, China, and Japan. Oil and gas pipelines, whether overland or undersea, simply cannot match the volumes of crude and refined products which can be transported by tankers and supertankers, and that too with greater safety and lesser cost. All these percentages I've thrown at you, we sailors actually remember them by what we call the 70-80-90 rule. 70% of this planet is covered by water, 80% of humanity lives near the sea, and 90% of all international trade is undertaken on the surface of the sea. Moreover, the oceans are a treasure trove of both living and non-living resources, and a major factor for food security, mineral sourcing, mining, and maybe also as an antidote for water scarcity. This is inevitably leading to greater maritime conflict and what can only be termed as the territorialization of the seas, as most tellingly witnessed recently in the South China Sea, and also in the spate of boundary claims and conflicts and disputes. Thus, the increasingly contested and vast oceanic spaces have progressively occupied strategic center stage in recent times, and the 21st century has been aptly described as the century of the seas. It is abundantly clear that the world is more interconnected and interdependent than ever before in human history. The entwined globalized economy, exponentially increased maritime trade, the internet and instant communications, quick and reliable intercontinental transportation, space-based imagery and location, and even long precision munitions, to name but a few factors, have served to shrink the point to where we can imagine humanity as a string of communities living on the shores of one ocean, the great commons, if you will. Humanity's prosperity, security, and perhaps even survival is increasingly intertwined with the ocean. It is no surprise to observe that all coastal states, large and small, are seen to be engaged in hectic maritime capacity building, inclusive of navies, ports, constabulary forces, merchant shipping, and what have you. Taken together, it would be evident to all of you that whosoever has power over or on the seas would have very great power indeed over almost the whole planet in terms of legal presence and access, and great prosperity too on account of power over global trade, markets, and resources. And that is precisely why sea power has been such a great determinant of human history. In the words of Sir Walter Raleigh, "For whosoever commands the sea commands the trade. Whosoever commands the trade of the world commands the riches of the world, and consequently the world itself." So let me now go on to sea power. What exactly is sea power? Clearly, it is both the entity which wields the power, such as a nation state or an empire, or even a non-state actor. But it is also the term itself, which has over the years developed many connotations, and the concept has different meanings in different contexts. International law, currently the United Nations Convention of the Law of the Sea, permits all manner of vessels, from warships and sailing boats, entire freedom of navigation in all waters, including even the right of innocent passage in the territorial seas of all coastal states. All applications of sea power flow from this simple fact that the sea is the greatest of all highways. It is much easier to move a ton of anything by water than by any other means. This applies not only to cargo for trade, but also to troops and ammunition and their logistic supply. The seas afford the cheapest means to transport bulk goods, though maritime trade, as we all know, is vulnerable to threats from various quarters: criminals, pirates, terrorists, rogue regimes, and so on. Clearly, in a globalized world of increasing international trade, international prosperity can only be attained through the security of this highway of seaborne trade. Maritime trade and maritime security are therefore completely interlinked. The interconnectivity and freedom of the seas allows all actors, from nation states to criminals, as I said, to legally access almost the entire planet should they have the maritime means to do so. It is therefore axiomatic that nations who possess sea power can hypothetically exercise it worldwide. Sea power is oftenly academically defined as the comprehensive capability of a nation in the maritime arena as a whole, including of navies, port facilities, coast guards, merchant marine, shipbuilding, fishing fleet, and so on. In other words, sea power describes a nation's ability to protect and advance its political, economic, and military interests through control of the sea. On the other hand, however strong a nation may be at sea, it is impossible for anyone to control all the sea all the time. The ocean is simply too vast, and the sea cannot be partitioned, occupied, or fenced. It can only be utilized to further objectives. Sea power may therefore also be defined as the capability to use the seas to one's advantage and interests, while at the same time denying them to your adversaries. Thus, intrinsically, the term sea power cannot be divorced from the military connotation, more so because the natural condition of the sea is uncontrolled and a free-for-all. Therefore, sea power traditionally denotes the capability of a nation to wage war at sea and achieve naval supremacy and military advantage over rivals, peers, challengers, and threats. From a military perspective, the sea can either be a barrier to attack or a highway leading both to our enemies or to us. Naval power creates the barrier and naval power exploits the highway. But naval weakness can make the sea an invitation to attack along the highway. A deployed fleet tends to keep problems at arm's length. Any control over the sea must be established clearly by naval forces on, above, or under the surface of the sea. These forces can then conduct the full range of naval operations from this controlled area. For the purposes of this talk, I shall use the term sea power in this classical, more military context. That is, the sea power that is exerted by navies, if you will, in the Westphalian world order we live in. But what is this Westphalian order? It came into effect, as most of you know, some 3.5 centuries ago, in 1648 to be precise, when warring European states signed a peace treaty at the end of a bloody, savage religious war called the 30 Years' War. This treaty was called the Peace of Westphalia, after a small region in Germany where it was signed, and it marked the beginning of the concept of the nation state. Today, 192 in all, who are sovereign and free to govern themselves within defined and generally accepted borders, be they absolute monarchies, totalitarian regimes, or liberal democracies. The cardinal principle of this Westphalian system of nation-states was respect for each other's sovereignty and non-interference in each other's internal affairs. That seems simple enough, isn't it? But as all of us do observe, the world order is exceedingly complex. The problem, of course, is the borders. They are not cast in stone, and they can be changed by war and conquest or by voluntary or forced mergers and divisions. There is no central authority which can enforce international borders, even in this day of the United Nations, as you may have noticed in the South China Sea, or in the Crimea, or in Syria, or many other places in just the last few years. In effect, the Westphalian system is essentially anarchic. Make no mistake, it is every nation for itself. Beneath the veneer of civilization, might is still right in the global jungle. More than 2 millennia ago, Thucydides, in his history of the Peloponnesian Wars, observed that the strong do what they can, and the weak suffer what they must. These words remain relevant today. That is why nations, big and small, maintain expensive militaries and seek to preserve peace through balance of power by entering into alliances and pacts with others, so as to ward off threats from enemies and predator states, very much like human beings who buy guns and join gangs for security. Though, of course, as astutely said, there are no permanent friends, only permanent interests. Nation-states struggle and compete sometimes for survival and advantage, often for land, resources, markets, and prosperity, or for influence, or for political or religious ideology. And the larger and more powerful amongst them are inclined to seek dominance, superiority, and hegemony. This struggle in all its forms, diplomatic, economic, military, using hard and soft power, is what we broadly refer to as geopolitics, and navies play a very large role in this constant, continual competition. As a consequence of the worldwide freedom of navigation enshrined in international law, naval forces roam the planet, and unlike ground and air forces, whose deployment is subject to and limited by sovereign borders, foreign territory, and national airspaces, this global access lies at the heart of sea power for those who have acquired the capability to wield it. It is therefore only appropriate that China's naval strategy to address the United States is called anti-access, anti-denial, or A2AD. The concept of sea control, which has primacy over all broader naval objectives, is the attainment of a dominating condition, which is, however, intrinsically limited in time and place. And it is sought to be achieved only for a particular area of the sea for a specified period and for a defined purpose. Sea control does not entail conquering or seizing all the sea, but just attaining reasonably unopposed supremacy in some part of it for some time. Ladies and gentlemen, navies do not defend coastlines. They actually go out to sea, seek out the enemy, bring him to battle, and destroy him as far away from our shores as possible. However, controlling the sea is a demanding proposition in terms of both force levels and operational effort, and can only be exercised by a blue water three-dimensional navy, who must have the wherewithal to use the sea for exercising sea control where and when necessary. Axiomatically, it follows that aspiring great or regional powers, seeking influence or having interests beyond their immediate shores and their land neighbors, must possess a strong navy. Technology has only multiplied the multiple advantages of sea power. In the modern era of precision-guided long-range munitions, navies now have the ability to attack the land, not only by long-range munitions, but also the deep hinterland, which can come and which can be described as neutral territory. Similarly, the vastness and relative opaqueness of the ocean makes the stealthy ballistic nuclear submarine the most survivable, potent, feared, and effective component of the strategic nuclear triad. India, too, has the potential, the latent wealth, and the technological base to acquire influence well beyond its shores by building a world-class navy. This process commenced after independence. However, it requires the collective will and aspirations of the people as a whole to pursue this objective. Maritime understanding and a seagoing disposition in the general populace is vital for the development of naval power. And this is why I have chosen to speak to you on this subject. So now let us look at this age-old link between nations and their navies. Nations that have recognized the potential of sea power have succeeded in becoming what we call great powers, with the attendant prosperity and progress for their peoples. History has lucidly recorded, and indeed the contemporary strategic scenario emphatically demonstrates, that the destinies of nations and their navies are inextricably intertwined. The lack of a powerful navy confines a nation to its limited geographical location, unable to further its interests or exert influence much beyond its borders, all at a detrimental cost to its economic well-being, more so in today's high-tech, globalized world. History has chronicled and strategists have accepted that no nation can be a great power without first being a sea power. Great powers influence global and regional outcomes by deploying their sea power worldwide. The Pax Americana imposed by the hyperpower of the United States today, after the defeat of the Soviet Union in the Cold War, however imperfect it may be, has been principally brought about by the overwhelming global supremacy of the United States Navy, much as Pax Britannica was enforced by the Royal Navy in the 19th century. The unipolar status quo is now being challenged principally by the PLA Navy and China's burgeoning sea power. So now let us look at this historical linkage. Though the Phoenicians, the Greeks, the Romans, the Arabs, even the city-states of Genoa, Pisa, and Venice, and indeed even our own southern kingdoms in India, effectively used the sea to enhance trade and prosperity, the real impact of sea power on the future of nations can best be illustrated by examining the rise of Europe in the 15th or from the 15th century. European powers discovered and conquered the New World, Africa, and Asia purely through the strength of their maritime power, and launched their almost non-existent economies through the carriage of raw materials and finished products throughout their territories, giving shape to the world as we now have. The rulers of Asia and the Islamic world, on the other hand, turned their backs on the sea, leading to a rapid relative decline in both power and wealth. But at the beginning of the 15th century, which is not too long ago, only 500 years, Europe was a relatively backward, and some say barbaric fringe in the then known world, consumed by endless fighting between innumerable small kingdoms and duchies and principalities. And yet, just a couple of centuries later, European power came to dominate the world and led to the prosperity and ascendancy of what we today call the West. What happened? What led to this great divergence of Europe, as it is now termed, from the rest of the world, rapidly propelling it through the burst of knowledge in the Renaissance, the Reformation, the Age of Reason, the Age of Discovery, and subsequent industrial, scientific, and social revolutions culminating in the Enlightenment? Actually, in the 15th century, the wealth and power of the world lay centered in the East. The Byzantine Empire in Constantinople, the Mings in China, the sultanates in North India, the Dravidian kingdoms in South India, the Tokugawa shoguns in Japan, and the caliphates remnant from the golden age of Islam. Then, in 1453, a seminal year, now considered the dividing line between the medieval and the modern world, 4 events changed the face of the planet. Constantinople, seat of the Eastern Roman Empire, fell to the Ottoman Turks. The printing press was invented. The 100 Years' War between England and France came to an end, releasing energies for more useful endeavors. And last, but far from least, European princes began funding maritime voyages of discovery. Besides causing an exodus of Greek scholars to Italy, where along with the printing press they catalyzed the Renaissance, the fall of Constantinople also resulted in the closure of overland trading routes from Europe to the East and to India and China in particular, giving impetus to Europe's maritime impulse. Though the causes may be many, from the spread of knowledge through the printed word to greater value for humanism, individual freedom, enterprise, to the weakening of the church and the feudal order, and so on. Most historians agree that Europe's sudden and dramatic rise was propelled by its maritime impulse. First the exploration, then the use of the sea for trade and conquest, commencing with the navigational feats of Portuguese and Spanish seamen in the late 15th century. Led by Prince Henry the Navigator, as he is called, the monarchs of Portugal, Spain, and later of England, France, and the Netherlands supported the maritime expeditions and adventures of a few brave men whose exploits would transform the world and propel the West to ascendancy. Columbus, Vasco da Gama, Magellan, James Cook, Walter Raleigh, to name a few names, are all famous men whose ambition and daring at sea transformed Europe. It was risky, difficult, and dangerous to put out to sea at a time when people believed the earth was flat and navigation in the open sea was almost impossible. Some scholars have argued that it was going out to sea that got people to think scientifically, to resolve the many problems of survival at sea. And this scientific temperament inspired the technological and industrial revolutions of the 17th and 18th centuries. Anyhow, anchored in their European territories, seafaring countries of Europe established colonial empires held together by naval supremacy. This was also the period that saw breakthroughs in the fields of ship construction and navigation, and all this enabled long-distance voyages. At the same time, advances in metallurgy, gunnery, and specialized fighting vessels provided means of overwhelming the marginal maritime opposition encountered by the Western powers during their colonial expansion. The establishment of the Portuguese Empire was soon followed by the Spanish, Dutch, and eventually the British, whose immense landed possessions were held together by the greatest navy of its time. Once the Spanish and Portuguese fleets had demonstrated the ease of conquest and the economic benefits to be gained by such maritime forays, the race was on, with the Dutch, French, and English adventurers joining in what became a scramble for trading links and political advantage. The defeat of the Spanish Armada by the British Royal Navy in 1588 marked the end of the Spanish-Portuguese Iberian great power status and sowed the seeds of the British Empire. From the middle of the 17th century, competition between the expanding English and Dutch commercial fleets came to a head in the Anglo-Dutch Wars, which were the first wars to be conducted entirely and fought entirely at sea. Even Russia joined the game, and through the efforts of Peter the Great, who used Dutch and English engineers to build him a navy and bring a maritime outlook to this emerging continental power. The 18th century, almost continuously there was war at sea and war between these new nation states springing from Westphalia. At sea, the British and French were bitter rivals, and the French aided the fledgling United States in the American Revolutionary War. But their strategic purpose was to capture territory in India and the West Indies, which they did not achieve. The Napoleonic Wars included a series of legendary naval battles, culminating in the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805, in which Admiral Nelson broke the power of the French and Spanish fleets, but lost his own life in doing so. Trafalgar ushered in Pax Britannica in the 19th century, marked by a general peace on the world's oceans under the ensigns of the Royal Navy, with Britannia ruling the waves. In contrast, and sadly so, Asia was devoid of maritime spark or impulse. China, India, Japan, even the Turks all missed the boat, literally and figuratively. Despite excellent maritime skills, because of the inability of their rulers and their populations to look seaward and understand the significance of maritime power. China's first permanent standing navy was established by the Song dynasty in the 12th century, The Chinese dominated maritime trade throughout Southeast Asia, well before Portuguese and Spanish explorers took to the seas. In the 15th century, the Chinese admiral Zheng He, pronounced variously, was assigned to assemble a massive fleet for several voyages abroad and sailed successfully through what is today the Southeast Pacific and the Indian Ocean up to Africa. However, for reasons unknown, the Chinese mandarins turned inwards, and despite Zheng He's pioneering efforts, Chinese naval power did not bloom again till very recently. The Japanese also had considerable maritime skills. In the 16th century, Shogun Hideyoshi gathered an enormous fleet to assault Korea and then China. However, again, later, the Tokugawa shogunate also turned inwards and abandoned warships. The Japanese navy remained stagnant until the Meiji Restoration in 1863, and then rose again at the turn of the 20th century into a credible navy which challenged the Allies in World War II. The Ottomans also built a big navy, rivaling the Italian city-state of Venice during the Ottoman-Venetian wars at the end of the 15th century. They were defeated once and for all at the Battle of Lepanto in 1571 by the Christian Holy League, and they did not venture again outside the Mediterranean, becoming only a regional power without colonial possessions. And finally, coming to India. Long before seafaring developed in the Mediterranean, oceanic navigation had become common with the coastal people of peninsular India. Millennia before Columbus sailed the Atlantic and Magellan crossed the Pacific, the Indian Ocean had become a thoroughfare of commercial and cultural traffic between the west coast of India and Arabia, the Levant, the Maghreb, and the Southeast Asia. Similarly, the Bay of Bengal provided a highway of kingdoms in the south to embark on cultural and commercial missions to lands beyond the Malacca Straits, as far east as Japan. Starting with the Mauryan emperors, Indian maritime activism can be seen through the Andhra, Pallava, Pandava, Chaukya, and Chola dynasties of southern India. From this apogee, India's maritime prowess went into rapid decline, mainly because the sultans and emperors of Central Asian dynasties who ruled in Delhi knew more about saddles and stirrups than about sea power. This continental mindset of Indian rulers was also shaped by their experience of invasions, which came from landward. While dominance over the Indian Ocean passed from the Portuguese to the British, the Mughals remained oblivious of the importance of sea power for their empire. Consequently, India's maritime capabilities and what existed of its naval power could not prevent its colonization. The arrival of the 20-gun Portuguese frigate San Gabriel of Calicut in 1498 marked the beginning of 4 centuries of control of Indian seas by European powers. Now you may all say this is history, long gone back, but the saga of naval power continues to this very day. In modern times, say from the 20th century, we saw Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany embark upon the creation of a fleet to rival the power of the British Royal Navy. Under Admiral Tirpitz, the Imperial German Navy grew into a formidable high seas fleet that challenged the supremacy of the British Grand Fleet, though losing by a narrow margin in the First World War. Simultaneously, Japan built up a navy that defeated the Russians at the Battle of Tsushima in 1905 and almost defeated the Americans in the Second World War. The efforts and losses of the First and Second World War took a heavy toll on the British Empire and on Britain's economic power, and the post-war period saw the decline of the Royal Navy. When Britain lost its mastery at sea, the British Empire also crumbled. The strategic scenario since World War II has seen the United States become by far the largest naval power in the world. Throughout the rest of the 20th century, the United States Navy maintained a tonnage greater than that of the next 17 navies combined. At the advent of the Cold War, the Russians, whose navy had been a coastal defensive force since the Communist Revolution of 1917, also made a bid for global power. With Admiral Gorshkov at the helm for 25 years, in a matter of just 20 to 30 years, the Soviet Navy spread its sails all across the world in all three dimensions and achieved a near standoff with the US Navy. The collapse of the USSR in the 1990s and the decline of the Russian Navy has given the contemporary world its unipolar status, with the USN having undisputed mastery of seas globally. Today, however, as we all know, we are witness to the rapid growth of the PLA Navy by the sustained focus of the Chinese government on acquiring maritime power and the consequent great power status. After all, more than its population, even more than its economic success, it is the recent advent of a stronger Chinese Navy in the 21st century with its aircraft carriers and nuclear submarines, which is clearly causing unease across the world, and especially in the Indo-Pacific. We can thus clearly see that right up to 2018, rich and powerful nations maintain large and expensive navies. Why do they do so? Especially when the affairs of mankind are all centered and decided on land. Why is it that, despite the quantum jumps in aviation, space, weapons, and communication technologies, nations across the globe, with US and China in the lead, are all expanding and building maritime capability? This is because navies possess unique attributes which enable them to disproportionately and decisively influence the outcome of events on land. These distinctive aspects stem from both the nature of the sea itself and from the characteristics and nuances of sea power. But before I go into the attributes, let us briefly look at the functions and roles of navies. Navies have four distinct functions. Deterrence, to begin with, both conventional and nuclear. Warfighting, with all its subparts. Maritime engagement with the rest of the world and shaping the battle space. And maritime security, which in today's age is all that we hear about with pirates and terrorists, etc. Navies also have 5 distinct roles. The military role, which is obvious. The diplomatic role in peacetime and in crisis, which is huge. The constabulary role in conjunction with coast guards and police. The benign role for humanitarian assistance, disaster relief, non-combatant evacuation operations, etc. And of course, the strategic role, with nuclear submarines forming the most important part of the strategic triad. Naval forces, which constantly operate in a virtually borderless domain, have certain unique attributes which enable them to further these roles and functions, and also make them an ideal instrument of state policy both during peace and crisis. The term gunboat diplomacy, which you all must have heard about, though broadly used to convey the coercive power of naval forces deployed in an area of interest, does not even remotely capture the range of missions and diplomatic signaling to which warships can be put to use. Firstly, access. This is the most important attribute, as I have said, of navies. International law provides for free and legal access for warships right up to the territorial waters of other nations. That is, I can legally go to within 12 miles of any other nation. Even completely landlocked states can thus become military accessible from the sea by use of long-range missiles and deployment of expeditionary forces by helicopters and the like, as we have seen, of course, in Afghanistan. Such access provides the opportunity for maritime forces to intervene at a time and place of choosing, pre-deployed to areas of interest, covertly or overtly, as circumstances require, Maritime forces are often closest to the crisis as they develop and are therefore able to respond accordingly. Second attribute, bear with me, there are 9. Mobility. Exploiting the access afforded by the sea, warships can move hundreds of miles every day over most of the world's surface. Exploiting the access afforded by the sea and the inherent freedom of navigation, therefore naval forces can move hundreds of miles unimpeded by terrain or third-party agreements. This enables navies to quickly respond from over the horizon, and they can just as effectively be withdrawn, disappearing over the horizon without stigma of retreat. This mobility, to put it in perspective, this mobility allows a naval force which can move 600 miles a day to be off Oman or Pakistan one day, the Gulf of Aden on the second day, and off Sri Lanka on the third and nearing fourth days. Third, lift capability. Sea lift is the only practical means of deploying large amounts of equipment and the logistic support that it requires for sustaining it. Even when an operation is a landlocked state, the majority of lift required to deploy and sustain a joint force will be achieved from the sea. Sea lift permits land and amphibious forces to transit to the theater, poise offshore if required, and then enable joint power to be brought to bear ashore whenever required. It is also perhaps the only means available for gaining initial theater entry if access basing and overflight permissions are not forthcoming from other states and allies. Fourthly, sustenance. Maritime forces have integral logistic support, including fuel, provisions, water, ammunition, and stores, all within it, which allows them to operate independently at long ranges without external support for protracted periods. The time taken for ships to be replenished is also minimal. This permits naval forces to sail at short notice, deploy to an area of interest using access and mobility, and then remain there, if required, for extended periods. Fifth, reach. The attributes of access, mobility, and sustenance, which I have just mentioned, together accord naval forces the ability to apply national maritime power at long distance from the home base for extended periods. This sustained reach of naval forces enables a wide spectrum usage of maritime power in areas of national interest overseas, which would normally otherwise be outside the influence of the nation and its other components of national and military power. For example, whilst aircraft may be able to fly long distances, especially with air-to-air refueling, they cannot sustain at the point of application of military power. Sixth, flexibility. Warships can calibrate their response in terms of visibility, intensity, and longevity as required. They can be rapidly positioned in an area, remaining over the horizon invisible, or become clearly visible to signal latent or direct national interest, as may be the case. They can employ a variety of means at their disposal at different levels of intensity. With graduated application of maritime power, they can be deployed on station to signal national commitment or quickly and unobtrusively withdrawn with little ado or notice. Seventh, versatility. Warships can easily change their posture, undertake several tasks concurrently, and be rapidly available for retasking by changing roles. They can, in seemingly offensive posture, appear and yet disappear in defensive deployment, sending subtle messages to friends and foes alike. Warships, of course, can concurrently perform military, benign, constabulary, and diplomatic roles at instant notice. Eighth, poise. This is something you need to understand. Once in theater of conflict, maritime forces can remain on station for prolonged periods, as I said. And they also rapidly can adapt to the tempo of operation ashore. They can signal political resolve and act as a force of deterrence or coercion. The ability of maritime forces to poise in international waters allows the footprint ashore to be minimized or avoided altogether. That is to say, the political complications and military risks of committing forces and their logistic support on land can be minimized, if required, or if desirable. Poise exploits mobility, sustained reach, lift capacity, versatility, and all the other attributes I mentioned thus far. Ninth, resilience. Warships operate forward in the highest threat environments. They are constructed to take punishments, and all vessels are designed to absorb significant damage before they become non-operational. While a loss of capability through damage will degrade operational performance, a ship's company is trained to restore systems to use or to operate in an alternative mode as quickly as possible. All these unique attributes of maritime power combine to provide leverage for events ashore. Leverage is both a strategic and operational concept whose effects can be directly political or primarily military. Leverage is achieved by using the attributes of maritime power to provide decision makers with options that can range from overt demonstration of resolve without commitment to coercion and ultimately to destruction of enemies. At the strategic levels, maritime forces can shape and exploit the battle space and expose an enemy's flank and rear. At the operational level, these forces can maneuver from the sea to attack, distract, disrupt, and even envelop a much larger force ashore. In sum, warships posing in any area offer the national leadership with an abundance of political and military options at short notice. Navies are therefore particularly suited to the modern world in which industrial area formal declared wars are passé and are being replaced by conflict-ridden hot peace instead of a cold war, in which powers, great and small, use their military power more for deterrence, coercion, and influence to contain armed conflict rather than fight full-fledged wars. However, there is always a however. Navies are expensive forces and call for financial, technological, and organizational muscle and acumen. They demand large committed outlays to build, maintain, and operate. Only economically strong nations can afford reasonably potent navies. Moreover, naval platforms have exceedingly long lead times for construction and fitting out with literally hundreds of systems, from weapons and sensors to diverse equipment for various requirements, from ammunition magazines to nuclear fallout-proof ventilation to sewage treatment plants. Further, warships and submarines require extremely skilled and technologically savvy manpower who must be extensively trained for long periods to operate, maintain, and repair high-tech systems far out at sea and far from support. Put simply, all navies require sustained and short funding for acquisition, procurement, and training, long before the platform or asset materializes as a fighting unit. There are no quick fixes, and certainly no immediate political returns. It would therefore not be far off the mark to say that only ambitious nations with visionary, far-seeing leaders can create and sustain a strong navy, which will always remain a prerequisite and prime instrument for sea power. Sea power requires much more than just ships and ports. The broad requirements were best stated almost 150 years ago by the great naval strategist Alfred Thayer Mahan at the end of the 19th century. And he said that the requirements for sea power is, of course, an advantageous geographical position or maritime geography, serviceable coastlines, extent of territory, a population large enough to defend its territory, a society with an aptitude for the sea, and last but not least, a government with the influence to understand and dominate the sea. With that, I think I come to the end of this particular episode. In the next one, I shall be talking about sea power in the 21st century, which of course is a different ballgame. Thank you.